Let's start here. State Representative Ruwa Romman joining us on the Georgia Vote and 11 Alive. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the obvious. You've made a lot of news in the last couple of weeks. You're running for governor now.
Yes, I am.
Why do you want to be Georgia's next governor?
I'm running to build a movement. The reality is that for 20 years, Republicans have controlled our state, and in that time, hospitals have closed. Our minimum wage has stayed at $5.15 an hour, and even our education ranking has been getting lower. And the reality is the most immediate way we can change that is to change who's in power. And so I'm running to raise the minimum wage, take homes back from corporations, reopen hospitals, invest in small businesses, and feed hungry kids. And for me, that is sort of the way that you should be governing.
You laid out a lot of policy issues there, and I want to dig into them in a moment. But I want to start with a broader question, because you rightly pointed out that it's been roughly 2 decades since Democrats have controlled the governor's mansion in Georgia. How do you flip it now?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said I'm running to build a movement, right? I firmly believe that the best way to reach voters and to change who's in power is one door, one conversation, and one person at a time. It was from the first campaign I ever volunteered for was Michelle and Jason Carter campaign in 2014. And I remember very clearly after that first door knock getting really excited and saying, what if we actually talked to voters directly? What if we had those conversations with them and told them what we're fighting for and not just be timid about maybe we're a little bit better, but have aspirations that we're working towards?
I am sure that there are going to be some Democratic voters who hear that and they're going to be nodding their heads along. I suspect there may be some as well who remember similar messaging coming out of the 2 gubernatorial campaigns of Stacey Abrams that made a lot of noise, got close, but eventually both failed. And they might hear you say this as well and have a little bit of skepticism. What do you say to that Democratic primary voter?
Yeah, so first and foremost, there will be no incumbent this time around, and the closest we got was in 2018, but at the time, our population was still somewhat different. Today, our population is even younger. We have more folks who are looking for a different direction, and to be quite frank, a lot more people have been left behind. We've spent so much time focused, at least down at the Capitol, Republicans have spent so much time focused on corporations and special interests, and a lot more Georgians are noticing.
Let's talk about policy. You laid out a couple of things that are important to you, but we always ask this question, so I want to put it to you directly. What is the #1 challenge facing Georgians right now, in your view?
Right now, it is the challenge of affordability. Everything is getting more expensive, and it's getting more expensive at the same time. Think about utility bills. They've skyrocketed. Think about the fact that even though everything is getting more expensive like food, wages have stayed the same, and we haven't really done much about it. Car insurance. We kept saying we needed tort reform to lower insurance rates. Once again, insurance rates are going back up. And so no matter sort of what profession you have, you're a small business owner, even what financial status you're in, everyone is experiencing some financial discomfort right now or straight up financial difficulty.
Affordability has been, and you'll probably be unsurprised to hear this, affordability has been probably the most frequently cited issue of the candidates when we ask that question to them. You cite it as well. How do you fix the affordability problem?
Yeah, I think we have to get our priorities in order. We cannot keep focusing on corporations. And to give you an example, this legislative session, we had multiple special interest bills fly through the legislature, but we haven't even once discussed the minimum wage. And at least in the past 12 years, my colleague, State Representative Dewey McClain, has presented a minimum wage bill every session that he was there. And it never even got a conversation, let alone a vote. And so, but when it came to, for example, protecting a corporation, a pesticide corporation specifically that could poison people from liability, it sailed through within 1 session. And so for me, it's how do we flip that dynamic on its head and actually center Georgians instead of corporations and special interests?
Let's talk about paying for this stuff, because I can hear the voices in my head and the voices of viewers who are going to be hearing this and saying, well, hey, if you want to expand healthcare funding, if you want to raise the minimum wage, that could put a pinch on some Georgia businesses, some Georgia institutions. How do you pay for all this?
No, thank you. I love that question because I am a policy sort of wonk, as they say. In the case of, for example, the minimum wage, right? we would look at it in a way that, hey, corporations are already paying these wages to other people outside of Georgia. Georgians deserve a higher wage. And so what if, when it comes to implementing that minimum wage, we actually put small businesses on a longer time span so they have more time to adjust. It's actually less disruptive to them. And the focus is on those bigger corporations because they are competing and they're getting a lot of tax incentives from us anyway.
So effectively staggering when the rollout of this rising minimum wage would be. So big corporations have to comply sooner. Smaller businesses have longer timeline to get ready for it.
Correct, because right now if you look at our tax code, it is very amenable to large corporations, but not so much small businesses. Large corporations are the ones that get the bulk of it. To the question on, for example, healthcare access and healthcare expansion, we're losing way more than we're gaining by not doing this. A lot of small businesses, if we're going to be talking about them, are shuttering because they cannot afford to give their employees health insurance. We've actually lost a massive chunk of the film industry, specifically because of the cost of healthcare in a state like Georgia. And to be clear, we've already paid these tax dollars. These are actually tax dollars sitting there that we don't have any access to because we refuse to expand Medicaid, which is a bill that could be less than a page long.
Talking about being a policy wonk, in your view, that's how you describe yourself and your view in state legislative topics. Georgia has a sizable surplus right now.
Correct.
What do you propose be done with those billions of dollars in surplus?
My concern right now is because of the federal tax cuts, we are going to be experiencing a lot of disruptions. So if I would be forced to use that surplus, it would actually be to keep us steady as we weather that storm. But in addition, that is already generating interest. I mean, there is literally generating constantly interest. What if we took some of that interest, which is constantly recreated money, and built some programs that could be micro-targeted to the communities that need it most? So that way we're not spending money we don't have or money that we might need on a rainy day, but it's actually a program that could be a long-lasting program for Georgians that need it the most.
Let's talk about some of your background as a politician and as an activist and as somebody who's been involved, even though you've been in the State House for 2 terms so far,
Yeah.
You've been involved in politics for a long time now.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Georgia, earlier in our conversation, has gotten younger. There's been a focus on younger candidates around the country. You are one of them. You're not the only one. You probably know where I'm going with this. You've been a vocal supporter of the New York City mayoral candidate, Zoran Mamdani. Do you see him as an example, as somebody who other Georgia younger candidates should emulate?
There's been a running joke that we're going to have one of those countdowns his days since Zoran's been mentioned related to this campaign, since 0 and permanent
We're back
marker.
at 0 here.
You know, but I understand why people are making that comparison. And to be clear, what makes Zoran's campaign so appealing to a lot of us is that he used and leveraged sort of this new media environment, not just to gain notoriety or build a brand. What he did is he leveraged it to teach and educate the population about the process of voting, of campaigning, but then pulled in a sizable number of volunteers. I think they're at almost 90,000 volunteers. And what I tell people is if we can recruit 5,000 volunteers by the end of the primary, 15,000 by the end of the general, we're completely changing the dynamic of elections in a state like Georgia. And so even though his policies were targeted to New York, what I want people to understand is that it's actually about the actual steps of electioneering, of how to run a campaign that should make that really compelling and should be the lessons people take of how do we go to voters and make them a partner in this process, because the reality is when we end up, if we end up governing, we would need them with us in that process. And to do that, you have to give them a policy they can believe in and understand and show them how to be able to make a difference.
I'm glad you take that tack, because I read your AJC op-ed kind of on this topic as well, and it was pretty heavily strategy focused, like you just said. I mean, it seems like you really admire the way that his campaign has been run from a strategic perspective. But I want to tease this out, if you'll permit me.
Please.
Your support for Mamdani, is it solely strategic, or do you also agree with him on a lot of policy issues?
Yeah, I think his focus on affordability is one we should be talking about a lot more, because at the end of the day, the thing about politics, especially with so much money in politics, is inevitably campaigns end up talking about things that an average voter goes, I don't really know why we're talking about that. That has nothing to do with my day-to-day life. And his laser focus on, hey, I talked to my neighbors, I talked to people on the street, I actually went out into the community and asked them, what's top of mind for you? That's actually how we ran our first campaign. I remember before we fully got into it, when we would go knock doors, the first question was, what's top of mind for you today? I would introduce myself, say I'm running for office, and then I would ask them that question. And that's what he did. He physically went out and talked to people, and then that's how he built his platform. And similarly here, we physically have been going out and talking to people for a very long time, and that's how we built that campaign. And so for us, it's about what if we did this differently? Instead of a top-down approach, what if we did it from a all-of-us-up approach?
Let's talk about, you mentioned that reaching out and having the two-way conversation. You're obviously a Democrat. The Democratic Party is a big tent party, and there are lots of different groups and factions and coalitions within the Democratic Party. There are progressives, liberals, centrists, pragmatists, which is a 3-syllable word that I should be able to pronounce. But there are a lot of people under this Democratic Party tent: progressives, liberals, democratic socialists, centrists.
Yeah.
How do you define yourself?
You know, I am letting voters define me. I think for me, at the end of the day, I would define myself as someone who is laser focused on the economic issues that matter most to Georgians. And so some people have called me a populist, some people have called me a progressive. And I think that's sort of a lane that we sort of fit in between. But the reality is that politics is changing. Those labels on left versus right aren't fully covering the dynamics of politics anymore. I really, really think it's become a more bottom versus top, top versus bottom kind of approach. And we are seeing it in our bills, in our day-to-day life, and even in the legislature. It's become very disconnected.
And there has been talk about this big tent party. There have been questions about the path forward for the Democratic Party, which is not new. When a major party loses a presidential election, there's always some soul searching, right?
Yep.
But even before the 2024 election, there was some tension inside the Democratic Party. And you played a little bit of a role in a moment of that. You'll remember back in 2024, you were possibly going to have a speaking slot at the DNC.
Yeah.
You ended up not having that speaking slot. And I want to read you something you wrote in an op-ed in Rolling Stone. You wrote that the decision to not allow you to speak there revealed what you called the structural racism inside the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Sure, thank you for that question. So the way that went about is it was a kind of a very, very weird situation where I wasn't even supposed to be at the convention. I was there for a very different panel and got really pulled into this and sucked into this. But I remember very clearly at the time thinking that if we want to be a big tent party, that stage needed to reflect that. We had Republicans on that stage. I mean, we had
one from
CBP,
Georgia.
One from Georgia.
Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan.
Correct. We had CBP agents on that stage. And so when you say, we're not going to give 2 minutes, and to be clear, it wasn't about me in particular. I just ended up being sort of the final coalescing name that everyone came around. But it was about any Palestinian, any person with my identity on that stage really did reflect a big problem, which is that if we're going to call ourselves a big tent party, there was someone, like a person on that stage glaringly missing at a time when this was a big issue for a lot of folks in the base. And so, but this is actually something that I need folks to understand, and we're starting to see some of that bubble up, is that if we really want to be a big tent party, we have to reflect that. And not just in identity or face, but also in the institutions that we are building. Are those voices at the table? Are they being represented? Are we just talking about them without them, which is something I'm very, very attuned to.
And I should just make a footnote here. The reason we say Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, you said there was a Republican there. He was still a Republican at the time.
Correct.
He's now a
or
Democrat.
I think maybe an independent, I don't know.
He wasn't a Democrat officially yet.
Yeah.
He is now one of your opponents in this
Yep.
Democratic primary. And I want to ask you about that in a moment.
Sure.
But you had a lot to say in that Rolling Stone piece. You also wrote that in that Rolling Stone piece, you said that you agonized over the decision whether to endorse Kamala Harris for president or not.
Yeah.
That was a pretty easy decision for many Democrats, but not you. Why?
Yeah, so me being Palestinian and the ongoing genocide in Gaza meant that I was representing a constituency and a population that didn't have a voice. But the reality was that no matter what had happened at the DNC, what had sort of gone down related to me personally, right? Because it is going to be one of those, well, they rejected you off the stage and you still endorsed them anyway. That doesn't make any sense. And when it came to that agonizing moment, one, it was, am I even the right person to do this? I'm a state rep from Georgia. I'm not even a member of Congress or any kind of national figure. And two, would the community see that as a betrayal? Because for a lot of people, a lot of them aren't from Georgia. Those who are watching this don't know what it's like to be in a swing state. And so the question then became, is it my role? Why am I even in this, right? Why am I as a state representative even in this? And what would that mean for the community? But the reality was that Trump was, as we are seeing today, a deeply, deeply dangerous figure. And on top of that, that this was sort of a campaign that had, 107 days to be able to get to the finish line. And when we have a state where we won by 11,780 votes, it was a moment that I had to do.
Did you feel in some ways torn between practical politics and your principles?
No, it was actually specifically around, is this my role to play? Why am I even in this, right? And who am I to speak on behalf of an entire community? I think a lot of times when you are the first and you're elected as a first, people kind of immediately put the microphone in your face when something happens related to that community. And I'm always very, very cautious of using that platform to speak on just my opinions. For me, it's, am I being reflective of that community? And so anytime I spoke, for example, with a party leader, I was always clear to say, I understand strategically why this is important. but the rest of my community isn't there yet. Here's what we need to do to win them over, because it was important for me that I wasn't just erasing everybody's voices for sort of political strategy in this moment.
I want to drive us back to some Georgia-specific conversation here in the remaining minutes we have left. I appreciate you making the time. I do want to spend one last moment on international policy,
Sure.
Just because I would be remiss, as you and I both know, you use the phrase genocide to describe how you view what is occurring in Palestine right now.
Yep.
You and I both know that there are people who agree with that. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene at one point used that word and made a lot of noise about it in describing the situation. But there are others who take great issue with that descriptor. What do you say to somebody who would take issue with describing the situation as a genocide?
I mean, to be clear, Congressman Hank Johnson did too, and I think for a lot of people who have been watching this issue, seeing it unfold, it's not even about my opinion or my feelings. We have organizations, including Israeli organizations like B'Tselem, Amnesty International. As early as January 2024, the ICJ had demanded that Israel, for example, allow food in to prevent a genocide. And so it's actually not about my opinion or my feelings, it's just the reality on the ground. And I have cousins there, right? A lot of us have family there. And it's not as if we're just bringing this out of thin air to say it. I deeply believe in calling things for what it is.
Who do you, I just want to be super clear, who do you blame for that then?
The entity committing the genocide. I mean, at the end of the day,
Which is?
In this case, it's Israel, right? Their military did not have to wholesale bomb a small strip of land, right? There are ways to engage in warfare. And this is actually something, if you go back to 2023, one of my Republican colleagues who served in the military pointed this out. He said, I served in the military. This is not how you engage in warfare. This is not how it's supposed to go. And so, again, this is not just my opinion. This is based on the expertise of others who know way more about international human rights law and military warfare than I do, and who have the expertise to back it up.
Let's talk about Georgia. Let's talk about the Democratic primary field.
Yeah.
I was on air earlier this morning, and an anchor asked me, you know, it seems like it keeps evolving, and I said it feels like almost every week there's a new candidate jumping into this. And I don't think I'm betraying any kind of journalistic independence in saying that's great for voters because they're going to have a lot of choices. As a candidate, I'm sure you keep an eye on the field as well. It's a big field of Democratic contenders. How do you stand out from the pack?
I mean, at the end of the day, the way that we are building this campaign is very different. We've been focused already on mobilizing volunteers, and we haven't even done our big volunteer push yet, and have volunteers from 40 counties signed up, hundreds of them, to be clear. We're going to be focused on, like I said, we were one of the first to put lines in the sand of these are the goals we want to achieve. Does this mean we're going to get every single thing if we're governing? No, but I firmly believe in setting those goals in the sand. Obviously, I am younger, but in addition to that, there are way too many people that have been in office for way too long and have become really disconnected. And so what if we brought a different perspective to the race and mobilized voters who for a long time didn't feel like their voice mattered?
I think Democratic politics in particular, in some ways, at an inflection point, or perhaps an inflection point. There are candidates like yourself who are floating a new theory, in some ways, of a candidacy. I've also heard from some people say, right now in Georgia, what Democrats need is a more traditional, moderate, centrist candidate. To people who raise that, what would you say to them in response?
There's that famous phrase that's the definition of insanity, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And in this situation, I see it as no different. Our voters need to have something to just vote for, not just vote against. And I think oftentimes we think that if we just put in the most middle of the road candidate, which by the way, I don't know what middle of the road means. When you talk to voters, every voter considers themselves a moderate until you talk to them about an issue they're really passionate about. And the coalition we're trying to build, the things we are really passionate about, are things that impact the most number of Georgians. And so when they say, let's just lean into another traditional candidate, let's just go to someone who we think can pull from here, the numbers aren't bearing that out. What ends up happening is for every sort of one of those elusive voters that we might win, we're actually losing 3 of our own to the couch. Not even to the opposition, but to the couch. And it breeds this, I tell people all the time, our greatest opposition isn't necessarily other candidates or Republicans, it's cynicism. Too many people have felt like nothing's going to change. But I mean, how amazing would it be if we did make that change happen?
You talk about the apathy that you see and some frustration, I think, is what you're alluding to in your view of some voters. Do you think that is part of the reason that Democrats were not successful in 2024 in the presidential race?
Absolutely. We actually saw this, that again, once again, one of the largest groups of people that didn't vote were that sort of swayed the selection were non-voters.
People who stayed home.
Correct. People who stayed home. And I think oftentimes we get so into the partisan politics that we forget there's actually another option for voters, which is not voting at all. And as somebody who has been voting since she could, it's very frustrating to me, obviously, but also I understand why. When I'm in that Capitol and I see what moves in terms of legislation and what doesn't, when I see the way that we talk to voters and about voters, I always think to myself, of course they would feel this way. So what if we change that? What if we actually centered our voters and our constituents above all else and changed the dynamic of not just the conversation, but also policy priorities, and maybe gave them a reason to come out? Because again, people are struggling. There are people working 2, 3, 4 jobs, and on top of that, we're asking them take time off to work or to vote, and not only that, maybe even help out on a political campaign. That's a really tall ask for a lot of people, and you better make it worth it if you're running for office.
Let's end here. We've covered a lot of ground. You've been involved in politics for a long time, relatively speaking, but you are still a younger member of the Democratic Party. You're a fairly new legislator in Georgia, 2 terms in the state house. To a voter who maybe has not heard of you, has never met you yet, your elevator pitch to them would be what?
So I am somebody who brings a lot of expertise to the table, even though I seem young. Not only have I done organizing in the state for over 10 years, but I'm actually a private and public sector strategy expert. I have advised executives on multi-billion-dollar projects. I have been doing this work for a very, very long time, and frankly, I would not be making some of the decisions that our current administration in Georgia has made in terms of, for example, the Pathways program. I don't think that we should be paying corporations more money than it would cost the government to do a program, for example. And so for a lot of voters who might look at a candidate like me and go, what in the world is going on? I tell them that, one, there's actually precedent for this. We've had 30-something-year-old governors that have actually put our state on a better path. For example, Governor Arnold retired our debt and really, really took us into a new era for Georgia. In terms of expertise, like I said, I love the state. I've lived in the state. I breathe the state. I mean, I could not wait to come back after I went to grad school. And so for voters who've never sort of heard of me before and might just only see a photo, there's actually a lot more here than meets the eye. And it's not even just because of me, it's because we've built a really great team over time that's really also dedicated to our state.
Representative, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.